The following program contains scenes that some viewers may find disturbing.
On New Year's Eve in Newfoundland, a killer strikes.
This was a gruesome sight.
It's an image I'll take with me to my grave.
Why would somebody cut somebody 53 times?
The evidence points to an unthinkable suspect.
The song, Kill Your Parents, it was a shocking revelation.
But the investigation goes astray.
They didn't find the murder weapon because they were looking in exactly the opposite direction.
Eventually, they uncover the extraordinary truth.
It was amazing to watch the investigation unfold.
If someone just told me the story, it's too unbelievable to believe.
19-year-old Greg Parsons is worried.
I was trying to reach Mom on the phone all day that day, and there was no answer. I'd see her on a daily basis. If not, I'd talk to her on the phone on a daily basis, always check on her. Myself and my girlfriend drove down by Mom's house. The bathroom light was on, and the doors were all locked. My girlfriend was waiting in the car. I had a key, but it didn't work. So at that point, I knew I had to make entry in the house, and I made entry in through one of the front windows.
Mom? Mom? Mom?
I went up over the stairs, called out for Mom. There was no answer.
Mom?
The bathroom door was closed and it was locked.
Mom?
So I just smacked the door knob very hard, which popped it open. I remember seeing Mom's leg and seeing a major amount of blood.
My mother, she's dead. She's up on the bathroom floor. Oh, my God.
You can hear the anxiety and emotion and concern and frustration. I think every emotion comes out in that 911 tape.
Is she breathing? Is she okay? I just peeked in the bathroom. There's blood everywhere. I don't know what happened.
It's heart-wrenching to hear it.
Rescue 4, we have confirmation of the call. Yes, Rescue 4, that's off James Lane.
At 10:45, police and paramedics arrive.
And it's a lady down in the bathroom. Apparently it could be quite ugly. Over. There's the one.
The lead investigator and his support investigator were called to the scene.
Also responding is exhibits officer Carl Piercy.
A team had been set up that included myself and 3 or 4 other officers, and we were responsible for the investigation as seen at that point. The victim was covered in blood. The clothes was covered in blood. Just simply due to the number of injuries, it was easy to rule out that this may have been self-inflicted.
The victim is identified as Catherine Carroll, 45.
is a tragedy to see that a woman was in her home and died a very violent death.
The first-person detective's question is the victim's son. But he's completely unresponsive.
The best way I could describe it is a feeling of numbness. It's almost surreal. I suppose you could look at it as an out-of-body experience. It's just, this can't be happening.
Police remove Greg Parsons from the crime scene and take him to his apartment across town. He's left to wonder who butchered his mother and why.
It's an image I'll never forget. I'll take with me to my grave.
The investigation into the brutal stabbing of Catherine Carroll is less than an hour old. Every detail of the crime must now be examined by the forensic team.
Some of the bloodstains on the floor appeared to have been diluted. Water mixed in with blood. On the edge of the bathtub, there was a soap wrapper. It was torn open and left there. One thing that we were looking for was hair and fiber, anything else leaving on the floor that may be able to link someone to the scene.
From the murder scene in the bathroom, they move downstairs to look for the killer's entry point into the house.
The front door had two locks, a doorknob lock and a deadbolt lock. The locks were secure. There was no evidence of them being forced. When we examined the window that Greg went in through, there was no evidence to indicate that it had been forced open or entered before that.
In the basement, they find another possible access point, a small window.
You'll always see a little bit of dirt, a little bit of dust on the outside of your window. That didn't appear to be disturbed.
The investigators came to the conclusion that the window was too small for anybody to crawl in through or out through.
No way.
How the killer got in is a mystery, and it's not the only one.
There was a washer and a dryer. Inside the washer, there was a towel. On the towel, there appeared to be a small stain of blood. This towel was from the same set as the towels that were hanging in the bathroom.
Let's bag this.
The bloodstained towel raises puzzling questions. Who left it? And why? As police wonder how it got there, another question surfaces. Where is the murder weapon? The entire property is scoured without success.
There was no obvious murder weapon that we located within our search of that house.
When her body was removed on January 2nd from the washroom, there was no murder weapon found. And what they knew at the time was that it was a serrated edge knife. That was the instrument that was used to kill Mrs. Carroll. Mrs. Carroll had this set of knives. There was one serrated edge knife missing from that set, but they couldn't say conclusively that that was a knife that was used.
The crime scene poses more questions than answers, but very quickly, a theory is emerging.
It wasn't a break-in entry. Someone didn't break into the house. It had to be someone that knew her, or somebody that had access to the house.
The bathroom in this house was also the only room with a locking door. So if someone was going to flee from another person, this may be where they would run to.
The torn soap wrapper, along with the water mixed with blood on the floor, tells an alarming tale. It appears the intruder committed the murder, then took a shower.
If someone had tried to clean themselves up, That's a pretty cold thing to be doing when the victim is still lying on the floor in the bathroom and the floor is covered in the victim's blood.
News of a vicious murder has the city of St. John's on edge.
It was the talk everywhere you went. What happened up there? Who did it? Where were they?
Details of the post-mortem only add to a community shock.
This was a gruesome sight. This was a person who had had more than 50 knife wounds.
Catherine Carroll has 53 separate wounds. With no evidence of sexual assault, police are left without an obvious motive.
Why would somebody cut somebody 53 times? Was it anger? Was it passion? What was it?
The coroner calculates the time of death.
The autopsy indicated that Mrs. Carroll probably died at 2 or 3 in the morning, or as late as 6, on January 1st.
Fingernail clippings are taken at almost every autopsy. Sometimes the victim may very well scrape or scratch their assailant and slough off some skin cells.
The tissue samples, along with the bloody towel recovered from the washing machine, are sent to the forensics lab for analysis. But to find a motive for the murder, police need to know more about the victim. Again, they turn to Catherine's son, Greg.
I came from a divorced family, and basically I was raised by a single mom, my mother. For her, life was a struggle. She was a recovering alcoholic, but she did always struggle to better herself. She always tried to educate herself. She was a go-getter. She fought very hard to be a good parent, and she struggled very hard with the tools that she had to provide the best life that she could for her. When it came to Mom, I was always with her. Like, we always did things together. And I was always playing practical jokes and everything, so just hearing her laugh, I used to love to get her to laugh for some reason. I'd play a gag on her. People would take it personal, like take it serious, a gag, but she loved it. She loved to have a bit of fun.
1, 2, 3, 4!
One thing with Mom, she wanted me and my friends at the house. She always said, if you're going to have a couple of beer or something, go down the basement. Out of myself and all my friends, none of us ever got in trouble because we weren't out on the streets. We were down in the basement jamming, having a good time. And she liked the music. I think that was a great thing that she done for us.
Greg.
The questions turn to Greg's whereabouts at New Year when Catherine was slain.
2, 1.
I was with Tina, my girlfriend. I spoke to my mom about 5 minutes after 12 and wished her a Happy New Year and told her I loved her.
I love you too, son.
Talk to you later.
And that was the last time I spoke to her. Later on that night, Tina's father dropped me home 4 o'clock in the morning. And that was pretty much it for New Year's Eve.
The interview lasts many hours. Parsons leaves the police station a grieving son. But investigators wonder if there's more to him than meets the eye. It's been 24 hours since Catherine Carroll was found stabbed to death in her home.
In St. John's, when somebody is murdered, it's a big deal. It's a rarity, completely uncommon.
There's so few murders, and who would want to murder my mother?
The police force felt the pressure to bring this case to a conclusion as soon as they possibly could, to try to ease the concerns that the community had that somebody could be on the loose that was a murderer.
Police canvassed the neighborhood.
They went around interviewing a large number of people that had dealings with Catherine Carroll.
You don't go into those interviews with biases. You got to be able to get people to tell you what they know, not what you think they know.
I just want to ask you a couple of questions.
The neighbor next door to Mrs. Carroll said they heard a bump around 5 or 6 in the morning, and it sounded like somebody moving furniture.
The story fits with the time of death, but it doesn't point to a killer. Police dig deep to find someone who might want Catherine dead.
There were a couple of people that were looked upon as persons of interest.
2 possible suspects emerge. Catherine's ex-husband, with whom she had an ugly divorce, and a man set against her in a bitter legal dispute over a recent car accident. But it's neighbor Cindy Green who points detectives to the most compelling candidate for murder.
She had spent many days at Mrs. Carroll's house. She would drop by for coffee or have a cigarette with Mrs. Carroll.
Cindy Green tells police her friend felt threatened in her own home.
She said that it appeared to her that Mrs. Carroll was in bodily fear of her son. In fact, Mrs. Carroll told her that she had the locks changed in her house because she was afraid of her son. She felt that Greg Parsons was the person responsible because she realized how fearful Mrs. Carroll was of Greg Parsons.
It's a stunning accusation. And it soon becomes clear Cindy Green isn't the only one who thinks Greg Parsons was a threat to his mother.
We knew from people in the area that there was a tumultuous relationship. She had told people that she had had trouble with her son. We were hearing that. That's the same thing that police were hearing at the time as well.
Yeah, we hang out all the time.
Police questioned Greg Parsons' friends, including a young man named Brian Doyle.
He hung out in the basement with Greg Parsons and his friends.
All right, who's ready to rock?
Even though he hung around with Greg and his friends, he wasn't part of the band itself.
Doyle tells detectives he and the other kids had an easygoing relationship with Catherine Carroll.
So one day Greg comes in.
He also describes witnessing several violent fights between Greg and his mother.
She comes down the stairs and she's like screaming.
Crazy headache.
Then Greg grabs him with his beer cans and just chucks it at her.
Doyle then provides a provocative piece of evidence.
Brian Doyle pointed police towards a tape that had been made by Greg and a group of his friends.
The song on the tape is called Kill Your Parents.
Kill your mother, kill your father, stab him once.
Greg Parsons even played the song for one of his mother's friends. It was a bit disturbing.
Kill your parents.
The shocking story makes police reconsider Greg's behavior after his mother's body was found.
How are you holding up?
Greg Parsons didn't act the way the police thought he should act. He showed no emotion. He wasn't freaking out, crying. It wasn't the way they thought they'd react if they found their mother.
There's also the question of his whereabouts the night of the murder. No one can verify where he was after 4 a.m., the time his girlfriend's father dropped him at home.
His father-in-law drops him off, goes to bed, gets up the next day. He didn't have an alibi that night.
To police, Parsons is looking less like a mournful son and more like a calculating killer. But they still need evidence that can link him to the crime.
They searched my house. They took things like shoes, some socks, some clothing.
On the shoes, there were some small, reddish, looked like projected blood stains.
Could this stain be his mother's blood?
We did a presumptive test on these, and that came back positive. Positive reaction means it's probably blood.
stain on a shoe, no sign of forcible entry, questions as to whether he was home or not home, all kinds of little bits of things that didn't add up to anything by themselves, together seemed to add up to a case against Greg Parsons for murder.
That case gets stronger when police discover their only other potential suspects both have airtight alibis.
They eliminated the ex-husband and one of the other gentlemen because they weren't in the province at the time.
Greg Parsons is brought in for a second round of questioning.
We were there for hours. They were asking me such strange questions like, did you ever hit your mom, or did you fight with your mom? And it had a very accusing tone to it. I knew things were really bad at that point.
I couldn't kill anybody. Somebody did.
I said, I want to do a polygraph, and the police said, no problem. I went up there that afternoon to do the polygraph. I said, so how'd the polygraph come out?
You failed the polygraph.
And one of the police officers said, Greg, at the end of this interview, we have no doubt that you had something to do with your mother's death.
The primary theory of the police was that Greg Parsons had gone home that night, had been dropped off, as he said, and didn't go to bed, but actually went to his mother's place, entered the house because he likely had a key.
Greg, is it you? Greg, what are you doing?
And then murdered him.
Police are now certain it was Greg who unwrapped the soap. Greg who took a shower to wash off the blood. And Greg who used a towel to wipe out before dropping it in the laundry. Eight days after calling 911, Greg Parsons is charged with first-degree murder.
It was shocking. It was unbelievable. 19-year-old male, boy, teenager, charged with murdering his own mother.
The jury is rocked by witness testimony of a volatile young man who abused the fragile Catherine.
What's wrong with you? What's wrong with you?
DNA technology of the day is unable to conclusively match any key blood or tissue evidence to Greg. Nor prove the blood on his shoe was his mother's.
The stains were very small, and I'm not surprised it was inconclusive because it would have been below their threshold of what they required in order to get results.
But none of that matters next to the prosecution's smoking gun.
The song, kill, 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 kill your parents, kill your mother, kill your father. When the jury heard that, I don't think there was any way that that case could have been won by the defense, no matter what evidence they produced.
3 years after Catherine Carroll's gruesome death, her son is found guilty of murder.
It was like someone took a gun to my head and shot me.
Parsons is sentenced to life in prison.
There's nothing like the feeling of lying in a prison, looking up at the bottom of another bunk and figuring this is what you're going to be looking at for the rest of your life.
But for Bob Simmons, Greg's lawyer, the case is far from over.
It was horrendous. This had no semblance of a fair trial. None whatsoever.
We're seriously considering an appeal, and I'm sure there will be an appeal.
And I had no doubt in my mind that Greg Parsons was innocent.
A jury has found Greg Parsons guilty of murder in the brutal stabbing of his mother.
The general public, I think, had a sense that that was proper and that justice had been done and life goes on.
But police were too quick to pin the crime on Greg, according to his lawyer.
This was never an impartial, objectively undertaken investigation based upon hard fact.
I had a pre-polygraph interview, which they riled me up, and they did everything to try to get into my psyche.
In fact, at one point during the interview, you said, "You think I did this, don't you?"
They had me almost ready to cry before they hooked the machine up to me.
I have no faith in the lie detector test. None whatsoever.
Simmons is also quick to dismiss testimony about Greg's troubled relationship with his mother.
Catherine Curl had a very, very sad history. Marital problems, drug abuse, alcohol abuse. This was a woman with many psychiatric and psychological problems.
Mom had her emotional problems, so if Mom could say anything sensational to you about anyone and get your ear, excellent, because she was so lonely.
Hey.
Mom. She could go up to you and say, "Oh, my son, he's a bad bugger, he fights with me all the time," or whatever. Anyone that she told this story to, well, they're the ones that came forward.
And you have this vomiting of all this hearsay evidence. And how much of these things she did say, I really don't know. But what I'm sure is that some of it was clearly and absolutely misconstrued, if indeed it was ever said to begin with.
The provocative song lyric had helped condemn Parsons to the jury.
They attempted to use this as indicative of a state of mind, a state of hatred, a clear indication that he had it out for his mother.
It couldn't be said that I wrote it and I sang it because I didn't sing it, someone else sung it. And everyone had a role in writing it, and it was just trash metal.
And that is, without a doubt, very flimsy, very circumstantial, absolutely inconclusive. They don't find any clothes that have any blood on it whatsoever. They seize his deck shoes, which do have traces of blood, but we called evidence to show that he had been in a fight. And indeed, the other person had got bopped on the nose.
I was in an altercation with a young fella, and he was up my face and spitting blood. And there was 2 or 3 droplets of blood on a shoe.
The investigators on this case never once entertained an objective, impartial outlook on what they had.
I figured, like, how wrong could it go for an innocent man?
Days after Parsons' murder conviction, Bob Simmons files an appeal.
I'll never forget saying, "How long is this going to take?" And he said, "This could take years." And I was just, it was a crushing blow.
4 years pass while Parsons awaits a new trial.
Decision, and I look forward to my day in court to maintain and prove my innocence.
While justice grinds slowly, DNA science bounds ahead. By 1998, police have vastly improved tools for blood and tissue analysis.
Once I spoke to the Crown, the very first thing he said was, "Let's do it. Let's resubmit these exhibits and have them reanalyzed and see if they can find anything."
My role as a forensic scientist was really to re-examine the case with fresh eyes. In 1991, we were using a first-generation type of forensic DNA analysis. It didn't really work very well with samples that were of poor quality or samples that did not have a lot of biological material in them. Forensic DNA analysis is now conducted using a technology called PCR. It's much more sensitive than what we had before, so we are able to obtain genetic information from smaller samples.
Charlene is able to isolate 2 DNA profiles from the crime scene.
One of these contributors was a female, and that profile matched the deceased. The other contributor was a male. The second step was to look at this unknown male profile and to compare it to Gregory Parsons' known sample, and it didn't match.
It's a stunning revelation.
All of a sudden, your focus completely changed. Greg Parsons is not responsible at all.
I had believed for so long that Greg was responsible for killing his mother, and now scientific evidence is pointing in another direction.
On November the 5th, 1998, 7 years after his mother's murder, Greg Parsons receives a full acquittal.
Took a long time to get here, but it feels good now. Opportunity to get on with my life.
I don't think I ever got closure. I was totally consumed with the police investigation. Like, they never ever gave me a chance to grieve Mom's death. It was just after me from day one.
Now, free from all suspicion, Parsons remains haunted by one constant question.
I want to know who murdered my mother.
The Newfoundland police are in disarray. Their investigation into a notorious murder put an innocent man behind bars. The real killer has walked free for 7 years, and the trail is stone cold.
This was a big deal. This is a murder of a woman, a conviction, a wrongful conviction, somebody who didn't do it, an innocent man. And they owed it, I think, not only to the community and to justice, but I think they owed it to Greg Parsons to put the same effort, if not more effort, into finding out who actually murdered his mother.
I was tasked as the lead investigator to conduct the second investigation. I'm now armed with the latest investigative techniques and science, and also I have the DNA that was found to assist me.
Sergeant Johnston questions every assumption made during the first investigation.
There's a window in the basement. The original investigators determined that nobody came through that window. I'm 6'2.5", 190 pounds. I was able to crawl out through the window in less than a minute.
In fact, Johnston learns that Greg Parsons and his friends used to go in and out of this window all the time.
Every one of us as children knew how to pop them windows and get in when we were locked out of the house.
Perhaps this was the killer's point of entry. No key required. In his search for new suspects, Johnston casts a wide net.
What we did in the second investigation was that we interviewed everybody that lived on Jane's Place. We asked them who lived in the house, who was at the house at the time of Mrs. Carroll's death. We looked at anybody that was associated with Mrs. Carroll. We looked at people that had been convicted of serious crimes that lived in the area.
He soon finds not one, but two possible suspects. Mark Hanlin is a local man with a history of drug abuse.
He broke into another house on Jane's Place and actually took a piece of beef that was in the fridge and spread the blood from that all over the walls.
Frank Brody also fits the bill.
This individual broke into a house on Jane's Place and had sex with a woman that was in her later years.
Besides having a criminal record, Brody once dated Cindy Green, the woman who helped convict Greg Parsons. He also knew Catherine Carroll.
He had been in Mrs. Carroll's house. Not only had he been in the house, but he also worked on Mrs. Carroll's locks.
Did Brody commit murder, then get his girlfriend to pin the blame on an innocent man? Both suspects are eventually tracked. If DNA from either matches the crime scene profile, police will have found their murderer. 2 weeks later, the results come in. Neither is a match. It's a huge disappointment, one that will be repeated again and again.
By 2001, we had obtained and eliminated 150 people through DNA.
Police have all but given up when they finally get a break. Sergeant Johnston receives an anonymous call from someone who knows the case. The caller suggests taking a closer look at Greg's old friend, Brian Doyle. As someone who knew the family, Doyle was on Johnston's list to be DNA tested.
At this point, I had not interviewed Brian Doyle.
Doyle becomes priority number one. But he is nowhere to be found.
He had apparently taken money from a drug dealer and left the province.
In his absence, police try the next best thing.
DNA is inherited from one generation to the next. So each person actually inherits half of their DNA from their mother and the other half from their father.
Detective Johnston manages to get a DNA sample from Doyle's brother. Comparing it to the male profile from the crime scene could break the case wide open.
And I looked and I said, yes, there is a potential there that they are related.
The DNA link means it is possible Brian Doyle was at the crime scene. Rumour has it he is now living in Ontario, just outside Toronto.
I contacted authorities in Ontario. They were able to locate that he was actually living in the area.
Peel Regional Police Inspector Mike McMullen is assigned to keep tabs on the new prime suspect.
After several days of surveillance, he was observed to cast off partially smoked cigarettes. They were collected and were forwarded to the RCMP laboratory in Ottawa.
We did receive several samples, one of which did provide a full profile that we could compare with our unknown male, and it was a match.
It's the scientific evidence they've been waiting for. Police are now certain that Brian Doyle is their murderer. But they're not ready to celebrate just yet.
The problem with the DNA match was that the numbers were very low. Because it was a mixed sample of both Mrs. Carroll's DNA and the unknown male DNA. So where do we go from here?
To make an absolutely airtight case, Johnston wants more than DNA. He wants Brian Doyle's confession, but getting it will require an elaborate undercover sting operation.
We contacted undercover operator Detective Constable Brian Adams and asked for his assistance.
Adams poses as a black market dealer.
Pulled in there in the afternoon. That time I was selling cigarettes and alcohol out of my truck. Brian was very quiet and he seemed to be withdrawn. And it took a few days to build up a little bit of trust. And after 2 or 3 days, he wanted me to supply him, and he would supply the cigarettes to the employees where he worked so he could get a cut of the money. Greed takes over in a lot of the criminals. They can see what they can make.
Doyle is let in on the action. Before long, he declares himself eager for more. Adams brings Doyle deeper into the fold. Then springs his next trap when he confides he's got a problem.
I brought it up to Brian that my wife was really getting on my nerves. She's going to take everything that I earned over the years. Then Brian volunteered to offer her for me.
Want to take care of him?
And he wanted to make sure that I wouldn't get mad if he did it.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
It's the response Adams hoped for. He now escalates the sting by informing Doyle that permission to murder can only be granted by mythical crime boss, Mr. Big.
We'll set it up.
Mr. Big, he had the final word on whether or not Brian would be brought into our organization.
Mr. Big's persona was developed to leave the strong impression with Brian Doyle that he was a man of influence.
Doyle takes the bait. He agrees to meet Mr. Big at a hotel. Completely unaware he's talking to a cop, and his every word is being recorded.
We got set up for audio and video. Myself and Inspector McMullen are in the next room.
Mr. Big warns Brian Doyle his organization is very exclusive. No one gets in without being ruthless.
Mr. Big told Brian that he did some checking. He knew that there was a police involvement somewhere in Newfoundland, and that Mr. Big wanted details of it.
Big thing is, I want to know if you did that.
And Brian Doyle got up from the couch, and I thought he was leaving the room. And he walked over to the hotel room door and locked it. And in every way, it was a very dramatic moment. He returned to the couch, and he declared, "I want to play." The conversation that followed made the hair on the back of my neck stand.
You never tell me.
Murder suspect Brian Doyle has been lured into an undercover sting operation with a police officer posing as Mr. Big. With hidden cameras recording every detail, he begins to speak of his horrific crime.
The law tells you never get away with it. Life tells you plan it right.
Brian Doyle starts to talk about the fact that he actually killed Catherine Carroll.
On that fateful New Year's Eve, Doyle was indulging heavily in drugs and alcohol. Then, in the early hours of January the 1st, he decided on impulse to pay Catherine Carroll a visit.
Crawled in through the window.
He cut his hand on the way in and dabbed it with the bathroom towel.
Went to the kitchen, took the knife, and took off his clothes.
You actually stripped off. Yeah. But maybe in the back of my mind, I was thinking that.
Brian Doyle runs in with the knife and kills her.
You remember something? Yeah. How was that? Dirty? Why? Why was it dirty? The window, door, floor, wall, what?
Killed her. And he says, I cut her. And he said, she didn't die. I said, I cut her again, she didn't die. And I cut her again, she didn't die. He said, then I heard this noise.
That's the air coming up. I knew.
Doyle expresses no remorse for his actions.
I felt untouchable. I felt like
With his victim lying on the floor, Doyle took a shower, got dressed, and went home.
Mr. Big says to him, he says, is there anything that bothers you?
the only thing that bothers me, that you know, we are one, and only one.
was amazing to watch that unfold.
It was a very long investigation involving hundreds and hundreds of hours. And it was just relief after when he admitted to it, confessed to the murder.
Brian Doyle is arrested and later returned to St. John's to face charges.
I was floored when I found out. Couldn't believe it. Like, why would he do it? He lived 2 doors over from the time I was 9 years old. Why would you ever think someone like that would do something so horrific?
I can't imagine how difficult it was for Greg Parsons to learn that it was his close friend that murdered his mother and left him holding the bag for so many years.
In custody, Doyle gives a full confession, but never explains why he did it.
Where did you go from there? Brian Doyle agreed to take the investigative team back to the crime scene and do a walkabout and show me exactly where he had thrown the knife.
When they get to the spot, the weapon is still there, right where Doyle tossed it 10 years ago.
They never thought to go up and look at a depot yard a few hundred feet away to see if somebody had turfed the weapon over the fence, which we now know that Brian Doyle, in fact, did. He left the house, ran through the backyards, crossed the street, threw the knife over the fence, and went on.
Over the years, I went through everyone mentally. There was never a minute a day that I never thought about this. Is it this buddy? No, couldn't be him. Is it this one? No. Is it Brian Doyle? No. It was a passing thought. No way, no way.
Brian Doyle pleads guilty to second-degree murder and is sentenced to life.
He wouldn't look me in the eye. So I screamed out in the courtroom to look at me. I wanted him to look in my face, and I said to him, I hope you suffer.
Brian, I hope you come out that box. I know you will anyway.
Thank God they found the person that did it, because this is the clearest case of someone who was absolutely and completely innocent. In fact, was miles away at the time of the incident with no real evidence to indict him whatsoever, and yet goes through this hell for 10 years. They took the best 10 years of his life.
Today, Greg Parsons is a fireman, married to longtime girlfriend Tina, with a family of his own. He is also an advocate for the wrongly convicted.
There's so many innocent people in jail. Thank God for advances in technology, because I'll guarantee you one thing. If it wasn't for the advancement in DNA, science, I'd be sitting in a federal prison right now.